Our daily reading today comes from Nehemiah chapter 1 through chapter 4. And our daily devotional today here at Carrollton Christian Fellowship comes from Nehemiah chapter 1. And what we see in Nehemiah chapter 1 is we see now a third group, a third party is going and returning to Jerusalem to help rebuild. So new hearts are being stirred, new desires, new movements within people's spirit that the Lord has and the Lord is calling. So there is a continued desire and a continued interest of the well-being and of the condition of the city and how it is going. And so this is many years after the very first and the initial return, the first return. So this is many, many years. And what we see here is we see that in the very beginning of Nehemiah chapter 1, we see that Nehemiah hears of Jerusalem's condition. So the condition was nothing glamorous. Again, the same thing that we talked about yesterday with Ezra's return, with Ezra's journey and that second group that went. There was nothing glamorous about the condition, about the overall condition, and there were still problems and there were still things and situations that need to be worked out. And so Nehemiah hears of the city's situation. And Nehemiah has a broken heart over the situation and over the city and the condition there. And what Nehemiah then does and how Nehemiah responds is Nehemiah responds with a heart of prayer directed by God's promise within the context of his word. And so anytime that we believe that our heart is stirred, anytime that God has placed something in our hearts, truly, anytime that happens, whether or not we believe the Lord is calling us out into something, we believe that the Lord is letting us hear something because of an interest that he might have, or anytime that the Lord intentionally even speaks to us and tells us something and lets us know of something and the condition of something, what we always need to go forward and to step out in first is always a heart of prayer. Always stepping out in a heart of prayer within context of the promises of God's word. So within the context of what God has promised and what God has said will come. So what God's eternal plan and what God's eternal direction is, that is what we step out in. And we always find that within the context of his word. That context of what God's heart and God's intention is never within the philosophy of man. It's never within necessarily the history of man. It's never within anything of business practices or anything like that. So that's not where we go to. We don't look to those things in order to direct us into how we step out into and what we seek and what we desire will come about. But instead, what we desire to come about is we desire the promises and the plan of God to come about. So something for the church today, where we see God's heart and desire very specifically with what God desires to do in each one of our individuals' lives, we see that all throughout the New Testament. We also see examples of that all throughout the Old Testament. So that's something that we get familiar with. We get familiar with the entire counsel of God's word because that is where God has promised and God has said what he desires to do in each one of our lives and also through our lives. So we get in touch with that. We get familiar with those things. So we get familiar with his word so that we will know what to pray when he shows us something. We also see that Nehemiah in verse 11, he had a heart ready to respond from then God's direction. His heart was ready. Once he prayed, he then sat and was ready. He was ready to respond with however God calls him to do. So quite possibly, perhaps in some of our lives, God doesn't always call us to go and to step out and move out. But there are other things that God does call us to do. Perhaps probably to pray for those and to give intercessory prayer for those who are going to step out, or to come alongside of a vision that God has given to another individual. Whatever it may be, we always respond from prayer and from prayer in context of God's word with a heart ready to respond from the direction then that God tells us specifically. And so what's important here is that we have a heart that is given to prayer. May we do that. May we always do that all throughout our day. So I hope that this can be an encouragement to you about how to go forward and whether or not you're driving throughout the day, whether or not you are at work, whether or not in a cubicle, whether or not you're working in a factory, whatever it may be. Continue in prayer, continue just seeking the Lord and having a prayerful heart, but also continue in the Word. So whenever and wherever the opportunity comes for us to continue in the Word daily, just as we're going to see over the next few weeks soon when we get into the book of Job and into the book of Psalms, God's heart and desire is that we will stay in his word so that we will understand what is true and not true, so that we will not be fooled and deceived of what we are to be praying for. So we need to be careful of that. And that's why we get familiar with God's word. And that's why Nehemiah was familiar with God's word, so that when the time came, he would be familiar with what God's heart was and what God's direction is. And that's why Nehemiah was used, because he was familiar with God's word and he then knew how to join the Lord and what to pray for. So I hope this can be an encouragement to you. And I hope this can encourage you to have a daily time going through the word. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.